Thank you, Wayne State. Thank you, Jamie and Emily, for your support in us just trying to carry the ideas to the larger world. You know, I want to thank you all for tuning in just to talk to me or conversate with me about Black People Are My Business, Toni K. Bambara's Practices of Liberation. You know, where does a book like this begin? How does a journey such as this come about? And, you know, for me, it really begins as an undergraduate student taking a course in African-American literature and being introduced, particularly a course in Black women writers by one of a really instructor dear to me, and being introduced to Toni K. Bambara's work. And finding the short poetry, the short stories to be amazing, and the novel, The Salt Eater, to be just overwhelming to the point where I had to put it down and couldn't continue. And it wasn't until years later when I was pursuing a graduate degree that, you know, a colleague really close to me at the time suggested this author when Bambara died in 1995 as a dissertation project. And of course, I hesitated a little bit because of The Salt Eaters and the fact that it is really, you know, an overwhelming book, but so rich. And, you know, of course, as I began the process over the next 2 to 3 years, 2 more of her books were released, right? A collection of essays, but then, of course, Those Bones Are Not My Child, her posthumous novel, which is extremely long. And so, tackled that and really explored Bambara and came up with this book, Black People Are My Business, whereby over the course of 7 chapters, you know, what I'm trying to do is really make sure that readers understand how important and understudied a Black feminist writer and pioneering voice for contemporary Black feminist struggle that she is, and the historical Black freedom. And particularly that this begins with her 1970 publication, The Black Woman, that it really confirms that point. And the work that she does as a writer, as a person, is all reflected from that particular project. And so you say, well, why this topic or the title of the book, Black People Are My Business? Mm-hmm. And, you know, in her essay, Deep Sight and Rescue Mission, she offers Bambara an anecdote whereby she's, as Bambara is a community worker, she's out in the community interacting with people. And her daughter says, Mama, you need to leave people alone. And she says to her daughter, you know, very lovingly, sugar, Black people are my business. And as I was working on this project, I said, that's the title. Because of course there were many other iterations of the title for this book, but this captures the essence of Bambara. And you see it in all of her work, that the people are her business, this cultural worker. So, and so, you know, throughout this text, I'm really examining how Bambara's fiction really extends the Black arts movement ideals and how it negotiated the tensions between Black feminism and Black nationalism in women's fiction in the 1970s and 80s in different ways than her contemporaries. And perhaps in some ways better than some of her contemporaries, I see Bambara's liberation impulse really privileging the process and the practice of the work of the people, educating themselves to cultivate critical consciousness. She's always engaging in this process of what does it mean to come into consciousness, and, you know, how does liberation come about? It's not just something that exists in a vacuum, but it's a process. And her fiction is really articulating that, and it comes across wonderfully throughout her short fiction. And so, you know, throughout, I'm examining Bambara's what I call a very robust liberation impulse that I think infuses a very robust Black feminist thrust in Black arts movement principles, such as change and dialectical ontology, and how she transcends double consciousness. And so I'm really reading her fiction as a sort of intersectional blueprint for challenging patriarchy and building a spiritually whole communities, right? And so I'm also in this paradigm looking at how she really leans into Black aesthetic and how she also privileges ancestors and the youth, right? So the ancestors and the youth have are paramount in her fiction, and she really recaptures, in my estimation, this Black aesthetic thrust that was a search for a new spirituality, as Larry Neal says, buried deep in the African past. And so I think she keeps this idea from being static by making it something new through the voice of women and youth. And she's constantly negotiating those tensions and putting people in dialectics, because, you know, that consciousness and progress and liberation, you know, it's all about dialectics. So for her, the people are key. And in my spiritual wholeness paradigm or aesthetic, the people are key. And the people, that spiritual wholeness paradigm emphasizes family and faith, faith in ourselves, community and nations, and the power of consciousness building. Feeling, do we touch the spiritual core of African diasporic culture for the answers from gospel to blues and jazz and spirituals and the shamanic? And of course, freedom, which people of color are still trying to achieve in this world, right? Especially in this country. And so I see the genius of Bambara is that she shows and teaches and is patient with people in her stories, just like she was in her life. And her fiction is constantly focusing on building individual consciousness and then community consciousness, one story at a time. So, so I'm actually using Bambara's words, as you'll see in the text, to really drive the analysis that's outlined in each chapter, right? This is Bambara's, these are Bambara's words, and those words are framing each section. So, you know, so what, right? So what do you do with this book? You know, and I just think it's a great text for graduate studies and Black studies, Black arts movement focus, Black women writers courses. People are teaching courses around Black Lives Matters discussions, women's studies, African-American literature. You know, right now, I'll go back to talking about our current moment. You know, this book, and I really try and get at it in the conclusion. You know, the life that Bambara lives and the fiction that she creates really, really, really models what I believe is important as far as the process of building consciousness for, you know, young people right now to be able to organize themselves, be it either in organizations, but also developing themselves intellectually. And, you know, so the stories are for, you know, as we read a story like, say, The Lesson, it's a story that is giving a lesson to the youth, but it's also, you know, it's a lesson for young people, but it's a lesson. Every reader walks away with a lesson about morality and how do you go about developing consciousness within this sort of Freirean paradigm of which is, you know, this sort of pedagogy of the oppressed. And so I know this is a short moment, but I just want to read a short section from the book that I think really captures the essence of what I'm trying to do with Bambara. And then, you know, I'm happy to take any questions or have a little bit of conversation prior to the conclusion this afternoon around this particular text. Bambara's fiction, and Bambara's fiction embodies a changing dynamic phenomenon that can adapt itself to prevailing social situations or can transform itself. Undeniably, Bambara accomplishes the seemingly impossible feat of expressing herself in a Black idiom, foregrounding African American discourse, individualism, and nation without sacrificing a Black feminist agenda. Her ingenious liberation ethos requires a partnership between Black women, men, youth, and elders, and sets her apart from her contemporaries. Thus, the spiritual wholeness aesthetic I explore throughout this book confirms a message or ideology that corrals Black nationalism and feminism into an ethos or aesthetic that privileges freedom of individual and the people in what Eleanor Traylor termed an Afro-Femme context. Bambara, in her own words, is concerned with women being, quote, considered as cooperative partners with Black men in the struggle for liberation, to strengthen the family system because it's a strong political cell, end of quote. She models individuals and communities trying to figure out, according to Bambara, where the hell we're going and why. And so I think, you know, that her work, her fiction is a dialectic. It's an exploratory process. It captures the very essence of this idea of being and becoming that I thought, that I believe was a major thrust of that particular Black arts moment, and particularly her iterations of it in her work really represent that sort of 2.0 representation.